Like I said, tonight our goal is to talk a little bit about what General Conference is, what has happened in the United Methodist Church over the last week, and kind of how we got to this point, and go a little bit into what we can expect going forward. So, I do want to answer one question right off the top, which is that we are recording this, hence the microphone for a third of what we usually have for Wednesday night. And we're going to work on how best to distribute this and everything. But if you know of people who are not here tonight but have questions about General Conference and kind of what's happened, let them know that we are going to be posting this somewhere and sharing some more details about that. So as we get into this, let me see a quick show of hands. Who grew up United Methodist? Okay, a bunch of y'all. Okay, I'm going to hope that it's about the same number here. How many of y'all had heard of General Conference before last week? Okay, slightly fewer. That's a conversation for y'all's pastors back home. Okay, so going to start out a little bit with kind of the 101 of what we call polity, which is the fancy seminary word for the basically civics for United Methodists. So talking a little bit about how we are structured as a denomination and as a church. So what I always like to tell people is that if you know how the United States government is structured, you've got a pretty good idea of how the United Methodist Church is structured. At the top, so providing leadership for the entire church, we've got the Council of Bishops, which consists of all active and retired bishops from across the denomination, and their job is to provide pastoral and administrative leadership to the entire church. So you'll hear us talk about annual conferences. Those are basically regions within the United Methodist Church. Each annual conference has a bishop that is assigned to that area, and then all of the bishops, both active and retired, are part of the Council of Bishops. Think of it like the executive branch of the United States. Then you've got the Judicial Council. That's a name that, if you've read beyond the headlines in the last week or so, has gotten a lot of attention. And the Judicial Council's job is to interpret and rule on the actions of the Council of Bishops, the General Conference, and others in light of denominational law. So that denominational law includes the Book of Discipline, and the discipline includes the Constitution, because just like the United States, we have a Constitution as United Methodists. But the Judicial Council's job is to interpret all of that, is to interpret actions within the church in light of the discipline and of the Constitution. Think about the Supreme Court. It's the same basic idea. And then you've got the General Conference, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time on tonight. So the General Conference is the top legislative body in the denomination, and that is the only group that is empowered to do two things. They're able to modify the Book of Discipline, so they can change church law, and they are the only group that can speak on behalf of the denomination. So you'll notice, if you are ever kind of going into the weeds with what bishops say, you'll notice that they are never speaking on behalf of the denomination. They are speaking on behalf of the Council of Bishops, or of the North Alabama Conference, or some other group within the church, but never the entire church. Another fun fact, General Conference, for various legal reasons, cannot actually be sued. They do not exist as a separate legal entity. I think Charlie probably finds that interesting. And sorry, Charlie, you may be the only one there, and me. But think of General Conference like the U.S. legislative branch, so the House and the Senate. They're the ones that pass laws for the denomination. They're the ones that really kind of define who we are as a church through church law. So those are kind of the three big players in the life of the church. But there's another really important kind of dynamic going on that it's important to know about as we're thinking about General Conference. And that's that we are a global church. So this is where we differ a little bit from the United States, in that we have a presence all around the world. We've got United Methodists in America, obviously, but we've got a very strong United Methodist presence in Africa, in parts of Europe and Asia, over in the Philippines and South Korea. In fact, y'all may remember that Wade, back in the fall, went to South Korea and visited the largest United Methodist church in the world. Has about 19,000 members, and it's in South Korea. So the United Methodist Church is very much a global church. We've got ministry in lots of different contexts. And to be honest, one of the interesting things about this dynamic is that In other parts of the world, we're seeing a lot of growth in the United Methodist Church, which we are not seeing in the United States. So that contributes to just a lot of those dynamics as we look at what General Conference does and how it operates. For a little bit of context, so General Conference, and we'll get into kind of what it's made of in just a second, but more than 40% of the delegates in 2019 to General Conference came from outside of the United States. So that gives you a little bit of an idea for just how much we are growing outside of the United States. But like I said, I want to spend most of our time tonight talking about General Conference, and we'll touch on bishops and judicial council and everything as part of this. So like I said, General Conference is the body that is the top legislative body for the United Methodist Church. So generally, according to the Book of Discipline, they meet every 4 years for about 10 days. Most recently, before 2019, they met in 2016, and they will meet again next year in 2020. So every time we have a presidential election, General Conference is meeting and talking about United Methodist legislation. So this was a little bit unusual, and we'll get into why in just a second. But in 2019, so last week, General Conference consisted of 864 delegates representing United Methodists from around the world. Like I said, about 40% of those came from outside the United States, 60% came from inside the United States. Now, the way that those delegates are selected is that they are elected by their annual conference. So here in Tuscaloosa, we are part of the North Alabama Annual Conference. Again, think region of the United Methodist Church. And the region for us goes all the way across the state and from a little bit south of Birmingham all the way up to the Tennessee state line. Within that, we meet every year in June and gather all of the clergy and then an equal, theoretically, number of laity together. And we make decisions for our area. So think about that like maybe a state legislature. But one of the things that annual conferences do is every 4 years, they elect delegates to represent them at the General Conference. At General Conference, out of those 864, there are equal numbers of clergy and laity. And the number of delegates for each annual conference is determined by the size of that annual conference. There's a complicated formula we're not going to get into for how they actually divide that up. But basically, each annual conference gets a number of delegates that they're supposed to elect. At the General Conference itself, last week, most delegates were the same as those that were elected in 2016 for that General Conference. The default is that unless there is another election held, it'll be the same delegates that go to a called General Conference as that went to the most recent regularly scheduled one. You should also know that at General Conference, bishops do not have voice or vote, but they do preside over sessions. So that's going to be important in how we got to this place. But just know that as a general matter, bishops are not able to actually speak to legislation or to vote on it. They basically play the umpires for the General Conference and try and keep things moving. So this is going to get a little bit in the weeds, more than we already have, I know. But I know that there have been some questions about how General Conference actually does its work. So again, General Conference, they are the only group that is able to modify the discipline. But I've gotten some questions about, well, what does that actually look like? So at a very high level, legislation at the General Conference begins as what are called petitions. Think bills in Congress. Those petitions can be submitted by any number of groups, including churches, general agencies, which are kind of the departments of the church that deal with things like higher education and ministry, or discipleship, or finance and administration. Those general agencies can submit petitions to be considered by the General Conference. And any others, including any ordained clergy or lay member of a local church. So there are all of these different ways that we get legislation to General Conference. And within those petitions, they are typically dealing with some kind of change to the Book of Discipline. It may be modifying something that it says. It may be adding something new. It may be taking something out. But if you look at a petition, if you ever just want some good bedtime reading and want to go look at a petition submitted to General Conference, you'll see that it actually says, okay, what paragraph in the Book of Discipline is this dealing with? What are the implications of it? And then that works its way first through a committee. There were 12 committees in 2016 who can amend it and vote yes or no on it. And then if the committee votes yes, then it is voted on by the full General Conference. If it receives a favorable vote, it becomes church law here in the United States, at least on January 1st of the next year. That is the same process that is used if there is an amendment to the constitution of the denomination. So the one difference with that is rather than a simple majority, which is required to change most of the discipline, changes to the Constitution require a 2/3 vote of General Conference and then a 2/3 aggregate vote of all of the annual conferences. So you add up the number of yes votes, you add up the number of votes cast across all of the annual conferences around the world. If it's at least 2/3 voting yes, then it goes into effect. Within that process, the Judicial Council is able to review legislation. So this is like when laws that are passed by Congress go to the Supreme Court for review. But what makes this a little bit different is that at any point in the process, the Judicial Council can be asked to review legislation. And that actually happened for quite a few things, as we'll get into. So I know that's all the most exciting stuff that you're going to hear all night. I recognize this is not what y'all get really excited about, but it's important to have that context for the rest of what we're going to talk about tonight, as well as what Wade's going to be talking about on Wednesday. So it's important to know a little bit, knowing kind of our structure and our system, it's important to know how we got to having a special called General Conference. Because for a little bit of context, this is only the second time in the history of the denomination that we have had a called General Conference. The rest of the time, it's happened every 4 years as scheduled. But other than this one, there's only been one other, and it was to actually form the denomination. So we want to look a little bit about, how did we get to this point of having a called General Conference? So you should note that the explicit issue of what was being discussed at this General Conference is the issue of human sexuality. And this is something that is not a new debate in United Methodism. If you go back to even like the 70s and the 80s in the denomination, you look at the transcripts of General Conference and you will find us debating these same issues every year since. And the reason for that is that there is a lot of disagreement over the denomination's stance on human sexuality. Specifically, our stance, and I'm just going to read from the discipline here, is that the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. And then it goes on to say in the qualifications for ordination, prohibition on the ordination of self-avowed practicing homosexuals. That's the language straight from the discipline. You can kind of see perhaps why people have some issues with that. And so this is something that we have been debating for years and years and years. And so we get to 2016, and it is clear that there is an impasse because you've got some very conservative delegates that are saying we don't want to make any changes. You've got some very progressive delegates that are saying we want to strike out all of these, we want to strike out all of the restrictive language in the discipline. And the numbers work out as such that neither one has a majority, but they've got enough that a lot of General Conferences getting held up over this one issue. And so the solution to that is there were some delegates that got together and had a little bit of an unprecedented move, and they asked the bishops to lead. Now remember what I said about bishops having neither voice nor vote at the General Conference? This was a little bit unprecedented because it was the delegates of the General Conference, as they were allowed to do, asking the bishops to come in to weigh in. And so this happened one afternoon in 2016. The bishops went back and met that evening, and they came back with a proposal. And that proposal was to form what would later be called the Commission on a Way Forward. And the commission was charged with a complete examination and possible revision of every paragraph in the Book of Discipline concerning human sexuality and explore options that help to maintain and strengthen the unity of the church. They presented this plan to the General Conference. The General Conference approved of it. And so they ended up tabling all of the legislation that was dealing with issues of human sexuality in 2016 so that the commission could do its work. As part of that proposal, the bishops recommended calling a special general conference. That is what we just finished with. But the purpose of that general conference was to deal with the reports of the Commission on a Way Forward. So that Commission on a Way Forward consisted of 32 members. They included a mix of laity, clergy, and bishops. It had a diversity of theological and ideological viewpoints, and did include members of the LGBTQ community. And over the course of about 18 months, they met around the world, and they did what they had been charged with doing. They examined the Book of Discipline, they had conversations, and they prayed and they discerned about how is it that we can faithfully move forward as a church from this impasse that it's certainly an issue at General Conference, but it's an issue that the entire church contends with in some shape or form. And so after they finished meeting, their final result was to make 3 proposals. And you've probably heard us talking about these 3 proposals or these 3 plans. The first one was what's called the One Church Plan. This is the plan that was supported by the majority of the Commission on a Way Forward as well as the Council of Bishops. And so they really put some weight behind it. And the idea behind the One Church Plan was that it would take out the restrictive language in the discipline, but it would also go into putting some specific protections in place for particularly more conservative clergy who did not feel that they could, in good conscience, officiate at same-sex weddings, as well as bishops and annual conferences who felt that they could not, in good conscience, ordain LGBTQ persons. And so the idea was that this would ultimately create a system where we could basically agree to disagree. We're not going to be, they said, we're not going to be of one mind on this across the denomination, but how can we loosen some of these restrictions so that we can remain together, but we can still make sure that, we are kind of moving forward on this issue. So that was the One Church Plan. The other 2 plans that were considered, first was the Connectional Conference Plan, and that is the most complex of the plans. It also was the least discussed at General Conference, but basically it would have been the closest thing to a split in the church out of any of the 3 plans. The Connectional Conference Plan would have taken our current system of jurisdictions which are geographically based, and it would have created 3 Connectional Conference plans, a conservative one, a progressive one, and a contextual one that basically would have been for a segment of United Methodist, it would have basically implemented the One Church Plan. Again, it didn't get discussed all that much, but it was one of the plans that they put forth. The final plan that the commission put out was the Traditionalist Plan. Now, the Traditionalist Plan would maintain the denomination's current stance and language around human sexuality, and as they put it, would provide for enhanced accountability for clergy in annual conferences and bishops. There's a dog back there. That violate the Book of Discipline. And so that was the 3rd plan that was put out. I'll also mention, because it ended up kind of picking up some steam at General Conference. There was also the Simple Plan, which is exactly what it sounds like, simple. It would take out the restrictive language in the discipline and not make any other changes. So all of that was on the table after the Commission on a Way Forward finished meeting. And once they kind of knew that the commission was wrapping up its work, the Council of Bishops issued the call for the Special General Conference. And it was set for last week. And the purpose of the General Conference, so one of the things about called General Conference is it has to be for a specific purpose. So with most general conferences, you get into it and anyone can send legislation about anything because they've got about 10 days to meet and to do their work. But for a called general conference, it has to be more specific. And they can only consider legislation that is in harmony with the call of the conference. So the called general conference, the purpose that was stated by the Council of Bishops was that it shall be limited to receiving and acting upon a report from the Commission on a way forward based on recommendations of the Council of Bishops. So the whole idea was that we are going to meet for the specific purpose of receiving this report from the bishops and processing it and working through it and potentially making changes to the Book of Discipline. So in addition to having that very limited scope for General Conference, 2019 was also much shorter than most General Conferences. Again, most General Conferences are usually about 10 days long. 2019 was 3 days long. In 2016, it took 3 days to pass the rules by which they were going to have debate at General Conference, to give you a little bit of an idea about how much shorter this is. As far as just technical pieces beyond that, there was also a single legislative committee. So what that effectively meant was that any legislation submitted would be considered by everyone on Monday, and then anything that got a favorable vote on Monday would be voted on again on Tuesday. If that sounds complicated and convoluted, well, it kind of is. But that is the process that is required by the discipline, and so that was the process that they followed. I'll also mention there were more monster trucks involved in this general conference. For those of you who don't know, because you weren't following Twitter during this, one of the gems of general conference last week was that United Methodist had to be out of the convention center where they were meeting by 6:30 Tuesday night because they had to start pouring dirt in where the delegates had previously sat to prepare for a monster truck rally the next night. There's a sermon illustration in there somewhere. We're not going to go there. Anyway, so being considered by the General Conference were those 3 Commission on a Way Forward plans, the simple plan, and then other legislation that got submitted and was considered to be in harmony with the purpose of the General Conference. So the 2 big things that kind of got discussed in that other category were pensions, because, you know, why not? We like money. Just going to be honest there. And disaffiliation, which is the process by which specifically local churches are able to leave the denomination. And so, but the big things being discussed were those 4 plans. So I mentioned the Judicial Council earlier, and this is the point where they start to really kind of have a role in what's happening at General Conference. So well before General Conference, the Council of Bishops requests a decision from the Judicial Council on those 3 main plans: the One Church Plan, the Connectional Conference Plan, and the Traditionalist Plan. Connectional Conference Plan, they basically said, you're going to have to amend the Constitution for this to happen, so we really can't rule on it. One Church Plan, there were like 2 or 3 sentences that they had some issues with, but those were fairly easy to fix, or could have been by the General Conference as they were amending legislation. And then there was the Traditionalist Plan. And the Judicial Council went through and there were some pretty big pieces of the Traditionalist Plan that they ruled unconstitutional. I'm not going to get into the details of why on that, because that goes into some kind of complex legal reasoning that would have us here for the rest of the night. If you want to have a conversation about that, I would love to do that. But the basic version is that part of our Constitution as United Methodists is we've got some of the same kind of principles that we have in the United States Constitution, things like equal treatment under law. So you can't have specific crimes that are being more harshly enforced than others. You know, we've got principles of due process, so there are some issues there. Again, lots of legal things that at the end of the day, the important piece is that there were some big pieces of of the Traditionalist Plan that were ruled unconstitutional going into it. There were some additional proposals based on that ruling that were submitted in hopes of fixing some of those issues, and those issues were addressed in another Judicial Council opinion that was issued not long. Actually, it dropped the first day of General Conference. They released it, and there were still some issues that they had with with that legislation. So going into this, just to kind of give you an idea of where we are at this point, One Church plan, there are a couple of issues with it, but fairly easy to fix. Connectional Conference, we don't have any Judicial Council opinions on it. Traditionalist plan, we know that if it's going to pass, or if it's going to be implemented, I should say, there are some pretty big changes that have to get made. So we get to General Conference, and one of the things that they did was they prioritized the legislation that they were going to work with. So typically, as you're going into General Conference, they consider legislation in the order that it was submitted. Because of only having 3 days to do this work, they decided to prioritize it. And the priority that they ended up working with was, first they considered pensions, second they considered the Traditionalist plan, then 2 disaffiliation plans. So remember, that's the process by which churches can leave the United Methodist Church. And then finally the One Church plan. Spoiler alert, they ended up not getting to anything after the One Church plan, just because of how much time it takes to consider legislation, and that's why they prioritized it like they did. So that priority was for the Legislative Committee that, again, met on Monday of General Conference. And their task was to kind of take a first pass at legislation. So during that, they voted to adopt the pension legislation, they voted to adopt the Traditionalist plan, they voted to adopt both disaffiliation plans, and they rejected the One Church plan. As part of that work, they requested another decision from the Judicial Council that addressed the Traditionalist plan and the disaffiliation plan. So this is all on Monday of General Conference. So then Tuesday, the final day of General Conference, they get back together, they have finished the work of the Legislative Committee, and they get back together as a plenary session. And so this will be the final vote on anything. Anything they vote yes on at this point will go through as legislation and go into effect in the Book of Discipline. So a couple things that did occur during that plenary session. First of all, the One Church plan, even though it had gotten rejected the day before in Legislative Committee, it got brought up again and ultimately rejected again because of a minority report process where if you get 20 delegates together and they sign a petition, then you can bring up something that was rejected by the Legislative Committee. You can bring it back up in the plenary session. So that was considered once again. That same process did happen with the simple plan, or at least it was planned to until they reached the end of the day. Ultimately, simple version, the plenary session voted to adopt the pension legislation. They voted to adopt one of the disaffiliation plans, and they voted to adopt the Traditionalist plan. So that gets us to the end of Tuesday. They adjourn a little bit late, and everyone goes home so they can start filling in dirt for the monster trucks that night. And so that's kind of where we stand now. Now, there are a couple things that are going to be coming up in the next few weeks and months. So first of all, remember how I said that the Judicial Council came back and said that there were some constitutional issues with the Traditionalist plan? Well, they actually did not change a whole lot with the Traditionalist plan. So the Judicial Council comes out with this decision, and I mentioned that petitions are individual pieces of legislation. Well, out of 16 pieces of legislation that make up the Traditionalist plan, 9 of them the Judicial Council came back and said, y'all need to do some work on this for it to be constitutional. They managed to amend 1 petition during plenary session after getting that decision. So there are big pieces of the Traditionalist plan that have already been ruled unconstitutional, and the general consensus is that when Judicial Council meets again next month, they're going to come back and say, nothing has changed. There's that 1 petition that they amended that may or may not now be constitutional, but they have not made any changes, so Judicial Council will not make any changes. And then that is also a question for the disaffiliation piece. So that process by which churches are leaving the denomination, that is also being reviewed by the Judicial Council and all of the lawyers for the denomination. I was actually in a meeting with our lawyer for North Alabama the other day. And their general consensus is that it will also be found unconstitutional. And at this point, the General Conference has adjourned. So whatever the Judicial Council says will be final, and anything that was passed and is found constitutional will go into effect here in the United States on January 1st, 2020. And so it takes a little bit longer for central conferences, just because they've got some different processes that they follow for General Conference legislation to be effective. But here in the United States, it goes into effect on January 1st. So the question that we've gotten a lot is, what does this actually mean for us? And Wade's going to go into a lot more of this on Wednesday. But as a practical matter, as a matter of church law, there is not a whole lot that has changed. Now, that's not to say that there hasn't been a statement that is made by the very fact of the vote. And we are going to be processing through some of that on Wednesday night. But as a practical matter, as far as legislation goes, the legislation that was passed by the General Conference does not make substantial changes to the Book of Discipline that will go into effect on January 1st. So that's one thing to remember, is that as far as our stance goes as a denomination, however you may feel about it, it is not changed at this point. And that really and that will really remain the case kind of regardless of what the Judicial Council says when they meet next month and consider this legislation that got passed. The other thing that we'll be looking towards at this point, so now the General Conference 2019 is over, we have another General Conference coming up in 14 months. Next May, the General Conference will be meeting again with a new set of delegates, and that will be happening in Minneapolis. So that's kind of the next thing that we're going to be looking at, because that's the point where if the delegates want to revisit the traditionalist plan, and if they want to kind of dig into that and make some changes to address the issues the Judicial Council comes back with, that is when they would need to do that. They may choose to bring back up some of the plans that were presented in 2019 and were ultimately rejected. They may want to do something entirely different. I'm not going to prognosticate on what General Conference 2020 will or will not do, but that's an important thing to be keeping your eye on, because that is really the next step in what happens with the denomination and with any additional considerations and plans that we're going to be having. So I know that that is a lot to process through. In seminary, you take a class on United Methodist polity that lasts an entire semester. I basically just squeezed that into about 45 minutes. So I know this is not the most exciting stuff that y'all are going to hear today. But in lots of conversations, Wade and I have been discussing this extensively since even before General Conference happened. And we think it's important for y'all to know, what is happening. Because as a Wesley Foundation, we are the United Methodist Campus Ministry to the University of Alabama. Wade and I are both clergy in the United Methodist Church. And so what General Conference does can and does affect us here. Now, what that looks like, Wade's going to be talking more about on Wednesday night. But like I said, we wanted you all to know kind of what is happening in the life of the denomination and what we're going to be looking towards next. What questions do y'all have at this point?